The iron gates of Blackwood Manor didn't just creak. They groaned like a dying man gasping for his last breath. Elias Thorne stood before them, a heavy brass key clutched in his trembling hand. He had never met his great-uncle Silas, a man described by the locals of Oakhaven, Vermont, as a shadow wrapped in a coat. Now, by some cruel twist of genealogy, Elias was the sole heir to the sprawling, decaying estate. The house sat atop a jagged cliff, overlooking a forest so dense that the locals called it the Throat. Legend had it that those who wandered too deep were swallowed whole. As Elias stepped onto the porch, the floorboards screamed under his weight. The air smelled of ozone and ancient rot. Inside, the foyer was a cathedral of cobwebs. Massive oil paintings lined the walls, portraits of ancestors, with eyes that seemed to follow his every movement. Their skin was painted in sickly hues of gray, their lips curled into expressions of perpetual judgment. "Welcome home, Mr. Thorne," a voice rasped from the shadows. Elias jumped, nearly dropping his flashlight. Out of the gloom emerged a man so thin he looked like a skeleton draped in a tuxedo. It was Arthur, the caretaker who had served the Blackwoods for 40 years. "The master left specific instructions," Arthur said, his eyes milky with cataracts. "Never let the lanterns in the basement go out. And whatever you do, do not answer the scratching at the cellar door." The first night was silent, too silent. In America's rural heartlands, silence is never empty. It's a canvas for the imagination. But Elias wasn't imagining the sound he heard at 3:13 a.m. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It wasn't coming from the floor. It was coming from inside the wallpaper. It sounded like long, sharpened fingernails dragging against dry wood. Elias sat up in his four-poster bed, the cold mountain air biting at his skin. He grabbed his lantern and followed the sound. The noise led him to the library, a room filled with thousands of leather-bound books, many of them written in languages Elias didn't recognize. The scratching stopped abruptly in front of a bookshelf near the fireplace. Elias pulled back a rug and found a hidden latch. As he opened it, a gust of freezing wind rushed up from the darkness below, carrying the faint, unmistakable smell of lilacs and burnt hair. He descended the stone steps into the sub-basement. There he saw them, dozens of mirrors, all draped in black cloth. In the center of the room sat a single, uncovered silver mirror. Elias approached it, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He didn't see his reflection. Instead, he saw a woman standing behind him. She was tall, wearing a tattered, white dress from the 1800s. Her face was a void. No eyes, no nose. Just a jagged, weeping hole where a mouth should be. She raised a finger to her lips, signaling for silence. Then she pointed to the floorboards beneath Elias's feet. The woman in the mirror, or rather, the absence of a woman, slowly receded, her spectral finger still pointing downwards. Elias's breath hitched in his throat. He spun around, the flickering lantern casting long, dancing shadows, but there was nothing there. Only the cold, damp walls of the sub-basement and the draped mirrors that seemed to absorb all light. He looked down at the floorboards where she had pointed. They looked ordinary, though slightly discolored, as if something had once been spilled there. Elias knelt, running his hand over the aged wood. It felt unnaturally cold, even colder than the surrounding stone. He tried to pry them open, but they were stubbornly fixed. Suddenly, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper brushed past his ear. It wasn't English or any language he knew. It sounded like the wind sighing through dry bones, a guttural, ancient sound. It seemed to come from beneath the floorboards. Driven by a morbid curiosity he couldn't explain, Elias raced back upstairs, grabbed a crowbar from the utility closet Arthur had shown him. and returned to the sub-basement. With a grunt, he jammed the crowbar into a seam between the floorboards and heaved. The wood groaned, splitting with a sound like a pistol shot in the echoing silence. Beneath the planks, it wasn't earth, but a deeper, darker hole. A rough-hewn tunnel, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through, descended into absolute blackness. The smell intensified: lilacs, burnt hair, and something else. Something metallic and sickly sweet, like old blood. Hesitantly, Elias lowered his lantern into the opening. The light struggled to pierce the gloom, but he could make out crude carvings on the earthen walls, swirling symbols, figures with multiple limbs, and distorted faces that seemed to scream in silent agony. This wasn't a natural cave. It was man-made, or something far older than man. He remembered Arthur's words. "Never let the lanterns in the basement go out." He looked down at his own flickering lantern, its flame dancing precariously. And then he remembered the woman in the mirror. Her silent plea, her pointing finger. It wasn't an invitation. It was a warning. But a warning he was already too late to heed. He had opened the door. From the depths of the tunnel, a new sound began. Not scratching, not whispering. This was a low, resonant hum, vibrating through the very stone of the manor. It felt like the earth itself was breathing, and with each exhalation, something ancient and malevolent was stirring. Elias stood at the edge of the abyss, the hum growing louder, becoming a low thrumming that resonated in his chest. He felt an inexplicable pull, a morbid fascination that urged him to descend into the darkness. It was as if the tunnel was a mouth, silently inviting him to become its next meal. He thought of Oakhaven's dark legends, the whispers of the throat, the forest that swallowed people whole. Was this tunnel the true throat of the land? A maw that led to something unspeakable? He took a deep breath, the air thick with dust and decay, and began his descent. The steps were uneven, slippery with moisture, and carved with the same horrific symbols he'd seen above. The hum intensified, a symphony of dread that filled his skull. At the bottom, the tunnel opened into a vast, cavernous space. It was not natural, but clearly formed by sentient hands, though not human ones. Pillars of rough-hewn stone stretched up into the unseen ceiling, carved with more of the grotesque figures. And in the center of the cavern, a massive, pulsating mass of what looked like hardened, ancient earth sat upon a raised altar. It was irregular in shape, riddled with fissures and glowing with a faint, sickly green light that seemed to emanate from within. From the fissures, translucent tendrils, like roots made of shadow, slowly extended, reaching towards the empty space around the altar. As Elias watched, horrified, a few of these tendrils snaked towards a pile of scattered, brittle objects at the base of the altar. He squinted, trying to make them out in the dim light. They were bones. Human bones, bleached white and brittle with age. And among them, fragments of old clothes, rusted buckles, and what looked like a shattered colonial-era musket. This wasn't just a tomb. It was a feeding ground. And the entity at its heart was not merely ancient, but hungry. The faint smell of lilac suddenly made sense. It wasn't a pleasant scent. It was the perfume of an offering, a morbid ritual to mask the stench of death. Burnt hair, an echo of sacrifice. Suddenly, a deeper, more resonant throb emanated from the pulsating mass. The entire cavern trembled. The tendrils snapped taut, then retracted, pulling something with them from the pile of bones. Elias watched in utter horror as a single, discolored human rib bone was slowly absorbed into the pulsating green mass. He heard the whisper again, louder this time, not in his ear, but in his mind. It was a chorus of voices, ancient and suffering, speaking in that same guttural, bone-dry language. It hungers, it wakes. You have brought it sustenance. The spectral woman in the mirror had not been warning him away from the scratching. She had been warning him about what he would unleash if he found its source. And now he had. The ground beneath Elias's boots didn't feel like stone anymore. It felt like skin, a cold, leathery membrane that pulsed in sync with his own terrified heartbeat. The green light from the altar intensified, illuminating the cavern with a sickly, rhythmic glow. "You shouldn't have come down here." "Boy," a voice cracked through the humming. Elias spun around. Standing at the entrance of the tunnel was Arthur, the caretaker. But he wasn't the frail old man Elias had met earlier. His eyes were no longer milky. They were solid black, reflecting the unnatural green light. In his hand, he held a rusted ritual dagger and a small silver bowl filled with a dark, viscous liquid. "Arthur! What is this place? What is that thing?" Elias shouted, his voice cracking. "It is the hunger of the land," Arthur whispered, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering on a grave. Before the pilgrims, before the colonies, this land demanded a price. The Blackwood family didn't build this house to live in. They built it to guard the seal. Every 50 years, the earth demands a tribute to stay asleep. Your great-uncle Silas, he couldn't do it. He grew weak. He died without fulfilling the debt. The pulsating mass on the altar began to unfurl. It wasn't just earth and roots. It was a tangle of ancient, calcified limbs and thousands of tiny needle-like teeth. It was an entity that predated humanity, a cosmic parasite that had anchored itself to this specific patch of Vermont soil. "The scratching you heard?" Arthur stepped closer, the dagger gleaming. "That was it, trying to claw its way through the veil. And you, Elias, have opened the door wide." Suddenly, the shadows in the room began to detach themselves from the walls. They took the shape of the ancestors Elias had seen in the paintings upstairs. Their gray skin and judgmental eyes were now terrifyingly real. They circled him, their silent mouths opening in a synchronized scream that only echoed in Elias's mind. The entity on the altar, the heart of the throat, extended a long, translucent tendril. It wrapped around Elias's ankle, the coldness of it seeping through his boot and freezing his blood. He fell to his knees, the crowbar clattering away. "The debt must be paid, Elias," Arthur said, raising the dagger. "Better one life than the whole town. If it wakes fully, Oakhaven will be nothing but a memory by dawn." But Elias saw something Arthur didn't. Behind the caretaker, the spectral woman from the mirror reappeared. She wasn't pointing at the floor anymore. She was reaching for the black-clothed mirrors that Arthur had kept covered. With a surge of adrenaline, Elias kicked at the tendril and lunged, not for Arthur, but for the nearest covered mirror. He grabbed the heavy black velvet and tore it down. "No!" Arthur screamed, dropping the bowl. As the cloth fell, the mirror's surface caught the sickly green light of the entity, but it didn't reflect the cavern. It reflected a void, a doorway to a place even darker than this pit. The entity shrieked, a sound that shattered the stone pillars. The mirrors were not just decorations. They were anchors, keeping the entity's power trapped within its own reflection. Elias ran from mirror to mirror, tearing down the cloths. Each uncovered glass acted like a vacuum, sucking the green mist and the shadowy ancestors back into the silver depths. The cavern began to collapse. Elias scrambled up the tunnel as the ground behind him dissolved into a chaotic swirl of glass and shadow. He burst through the library floorboards just as the entire sub-basement imploded. He didn't stop. He ran out of the front doors, past the screaming iron gates, and into the cold morning air of Vermont. He didn't look back until he reached the edge of the town. When he finally turned, Blackwood Manor was gone. In its place stood only a jagged cliff and a forest that seemed a little less dark, as if a great weight had been lifted from the trees. Elias Thorne left Oakhaven that day and never returned. He moved to the desert, where there are no basements, no old woods, and no mirrors in his house. But sometimes, in the dead of night, when the wind blows just right, he still hears it, a faint, rhythmic scritch, scritch, scritch coming from the back of his mind. Because once the earth knows your name, it never truly stops being hungry.